Dark levels in games are usually seen as annoying and gimmicky, but it doesn't have to be like this. Plenty of games use darkness as a part of effective gameplay systems, and it doesn't need to be used as a dedicated level gimmick in order to have an effect on gameplay. Probably the most obvious thing to mention when it comes to darkness as a non-gimmick in games is the horror genre. Horror games thrive in darkness, so the darker something is, the scarier it must be, right? Well, I'm by no means a horror expert, but it should be pretty obvious that this isn't really any more scary than this. So how do we find the middle ground between this and that makes people afraid? First of all, it's not just the lighting of a scene that affects how scary it is. As I mentioned, I'm not a horror expert, but someone who is could probably write at least an hour-long video about everything that goes into making a game scary, and I'm sure dozens of people already have. So generally speaking, your lighting in a horror game is going to depend on things like sound design, level design, and the dozen or so other things that are under those two massive umbrella terms, which I can't be bothered to list. But as we saw a couple seconds ago, the solution is never just make it as dark as possible. Obviously, if the whole game is dark enough that you can't see shit, it very quickly stops being scary and instead just feels annoying and unfair. Conversely, if the whole game is the same amount of darkness, but just generally a little hard to see, it all becomes the same and no areas really stand out as more or less scary, which can be a problem when you're trying to build tension. It's a balancing act. So like I said, how dark an area should be in a horror game is going to depend on a lot of other factors. So aside from making a game scary, what else is darkness used for? Well, as we know, humans have 5 senses, and currently only really 2 of them can be used for playing video games. You could argue that we use touch with controllers that have rumble and balance in VR or something, but those aren't nearly developed to the point that sight and sound are. So in video games, we're already working with 2/5 of what we'd have in reality, but what if we took away some of that visual information? We experience things visually through differences. If you put 2 different hues next to each other, you can tell that they're 2 different hues, unless you're colorblind and the hues are hues that colorblind people can't tell the difference between. If you put 2 different brightness values next to each other, you can tell that they're different values. If you put 2 of the same hue with different saturations next to each other, you can tell that they're different saturation values. If 2 3D objects are at different depths, you can tell that they're at different depths. When we combine all this, we can tell that these 2 plushies are 2 different objects, despite the fact that the pixels that make them up are clumped together in roughly the same spot on your screen. They're different hues, different brightness values, different saturations, and at different depths. So now you might be asking, what the fuck am I talking about, and what does this have to do with darkness in video games? Well, all of those things, mainly hue, saturation, and value, are affected by external light. If there's too much external light, everything gets washed out, and we can no longer tell the difference between 2 objects. Conversely, if there's not enough light, there's nothing to bounce those color values into our eyes or in-game camera, and again, we can no longer tell the difference between our 2 objects. Another word for difference in this context is contrast. Contrast usually shows up as a slider paired with brightness in most image and video editing softwares. If we turn the contrast slider all the way down, it makes everything in the image as similar as possible. This neutral gray that's mathematically the exact middle point between black and white. If we turn it all the way up, it decides on a certain threshold between similar colors and makes all of those the same while making them as different as possible from their surrounding colors. So again, you're probably asking, what the fuck am I talking about, and what does this have to do with darkness in video games? As I mentioned, if there's not enough light in the scene, we can no longer tell the difference between objects. So darkness is in effect a way of reducing the contrast of a scene, and thus reducing the amount of visual information the player has. The amount of reduction varies a lot across games. Super Mario Maker 2, for example, takes a pretty heavy-handed approach in which dark levels are pitch black outside of light sources. So it's on the level creator to fairly spread these sources around in a way that guides the player towards the end without making it feel crowded or too easy. Minecraft takes a different approach. On the surface at nighttime, it's still pretty easy to see what's going on, which is good because there will be monsters spawning everywhere. When you're underground, on the other hand, it can be much harder to see without a light source, which encourages players to prepare for mining sessions. And aside from being more dangerous, it makes it a lot harder to find what you're looking for because you can't tell the difference between blocks as easily. Contrast applies to loads of other things in visual design as well. I mean, you could argue that pretty much all visual aspects of all art mediums are solely reliant on contrast to convey their ideas. Within game development specifically though, things like level design also really depend on contrast. People don't really like doing the same thing over and over, so you have to make sure your challenges are different from one another. So that's all pretty cool, but what if a player could control how light or dark an environment is? In most games, the flashlight is nothing more than a utility. You can turn it on and off, and it flashes light. In Subnautica, the game's flashlight can be used at nighttime or when exploring caves, but then you get the Sea Glide, which has a flashlight built in, making the standalone version completely irrelevant. But it could be so much more than that, right? Going back to horror games, Silent Hill specifically, a lot of the indoor environments are really dark, and the flashlight's pretty much necessary to find your way through them. The only problem is, of course, that having your flashlight on alerts enemies to your presence. So you can either try and weave through enemies without really being able to see, which could save ammo if you're careful enough, or you can just keep your flashlight on and fire at will. You also have to have the flashlight turned on in order to see the map, which is a nice touch. But did I even really have to explain that? I mean, I guess it's a good thing if a system is so straightforward that I feel like an idiot standing here explaining to you that enemies can see you easier when your flashlight is turned on, but in a sense, it still feels very utility-based, rather than being something that the player can really use to have an effect on the state of the game. The closest thing I can think of like that is in The Long Dark, in which wolves, which are the most consistent threat in the game, are generally avoidant of light. So if you have to sleep out in the wilderness in a sleeping bag, it's best to set up a campfire near you so that a wolf is less likely to attack you in your sleep, and so that you don't freeze to death. There are also flares and torches you can throw down, which will usually deter them, and a flare gun, which always sends them away. So that pushes those systems slightly further, but outside of that, all of these items are pretty much just utility. If you know of a game that uses a flashlight or some other means of player-controlled light production as a gameplay mechanic beyond just utility, let me know in the comments, because I've made myself very curious while writing this paragraph. Going back to using a flashlight at night, some games have day and night cycles, which means that for about half your time playing the game, it's light, and for the other half, it's dark. So how do developers make sure that players don't spend 50% of the time playing the game blind and annoyed? Well, for some games, they don't. I went over this in a video I made a while ago about a game that I'm definitely still working on. But let's compare two games' nighttime environments side by side, Ark Survival Evolved and Slime Rancher 2. Now, do we notice anything about this scene that we've learned is a problem in this video? I'll give you a couple seconds to comment your answer down below. That's right, you can't see shit. Okay, well what happens if we pull out this game's version of the humble flashlight, the torch? Oh, of course, you still can't see shit. Now, let's look at Slime Rancher 2's nighttime environment. Wow, what a difference. We can now actually see the fucking video game. Okay, pretentious, sarcastic, dry humor aside, let's give Ark a proper once over here and see what it's actually doing wrong. So the obvious counterpoint is that these are two very different games. Slime Rancher doesn't really have a lot of threats in the environment, even at night, so there's no reason to hide anything during it, and there's no extra gameplay that would be pushed by obscuring the player's vision. With Ark, on the other hand, pretty much everywhere on the map, you have the potential of encountering a threatening, aggressive, carnivorous dinosaur. So theoretically, reducing the amount of visual information the player has by making it dark out at night adds a layer of challenge on top of the already existing gameplay experience, right? Theoretically, yes. The two questions we have to ask when it comes to this are, what is the intended purpose of the feature, and what is the actual effect on a player's gameplay experience? Obviously, I didn't make this game, so I don't know the intended purpose, but I can make a couple educated guesses. Maybe they wanted to make the game scary. Getting attacked by a dinosaur you didn't know was there 3 seconds ago could be scary, and that would make sense. Maybe it's what I said earlier, just add a bit more challenge to exploring at night if the player isn't sufficiently prepared for it. Or, what I think is most likely, most survival games have a day-night cycle, Ark is a survival game, so the devs decided to add a day-night cycle without really putting in the time to tweak the brightness at night. As for the actual effect on the player's experience, let's assume that players will either be cautious or risk-taking. At nighttime, a risk-taking player will completely, or at least mostly, disregard the fact that it's dark and do what they were planning on doing anyways. Maybe their tactics will change, they might be a little bit more careful than they otherwise would be, but for the most part, their experience will just be limited in some way. A cautious player will most likely stay in their base at night, spending their time doing things like crafting, organizing, or going to make a sandwich while they wait for it to not be dark anymore. It just serves as an inconvenience. There's also, as always, the argument of realism. It is true that this is more accurate to reality than this. But video games are not real life. They're designed with intent in order to give the player a satisfying experience. And yes, sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, realism does help push that experience to be more satisfactory. In this case though, making it nearly impossible to see for 20 minutes straight 50% of the time doesn't really help. So is this whole section just to say that how dark it is at night in Ark is slightly overtuned and could probably be fixed by adding a tiny bit more ambient light in the environment? Well, in my opinion, yes. And that's the most important part, that this is my opinion, and you should not be taking it as fact just because I have a couple hundred subscribers and say fancy sentences like, what is the intended purpose of this feature and what is the actual effect on a player's gameplay experience? Maybe you like how dark it is, and you think that makes it scarier and challenging in a way that isn't just annoying. Maybe you think that the torch is good enough at lighting the environment when it's dark. Anyways, that was way too much complaining, so let's finish off by looking at a good example of a day-night cycle and go back to the long dark. Much like Minecraft, you can still see decently well outside at night. Indoors though, it can get pretty much impossible to see when it's dark out. However, the indoor environments are small enough that using temporary, consumable matches, or this game's version of the humble flashlight, the storm lantern, is more than enough to be able to see. The long dark also has another way of reducing the player's visibility: the weather. Blizzards and heavy fog can make it nearly impossible to see, similar to Ark, but these events are much more rare than Ark's 50% of the time. There's also the benefit of the fact that you can sleep or wait in the long dark, which can skip long periods of time if you don't want to risk going out and exploring in undesirable conditions. All of this makes for a pretty effective day-night cycle gameplay-wise. So that's about it. Let me know in the comments of any games you know that use darkness or lighting in a cool way. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and thank you for watching.